Legend Terrible here, and today we're doing another tier list using Tier Maker, this time covering all the recruitable laws of magic for campaign in Total War Warhammer 2. So before we get started ranking these, we do need to get some ground rules sorted so that nobody's confused as to what we're rating this based on. This is based off campaign play, not based on multiplayer. You're probably going to get different results with certain laws of magic in multiplayer compared to single player, because players and the battle flow is definitely different in single player than multiplayer. This is also based around ultra unit scale, because the scale that you're playing on affects how damaging a lot of these spells are by quite a dramatic effect. Whereas the actual difficulty that you're playing on the campaign, whether it be easy or legendary, actually makes no difference for any of these laws of magic. So difficulty rating doesn't matter at all, but the unit scale does. Now, generally, as a general rule of thumb, laws of magic are, generally speaking, way more powerful on smaller unit scales than ultra, especially if that law of magic has any sort of direct damage spells, because those spells are, they're not scaled at all based off unit scale. They do the exact same amount of damage on small unit scale as they do on ultra, but on small unit scale, entities have like 1/4 the amount of health, so a couple of spirit leeches can end up wiping out a lord, whereas on ultra that just wouldn't happen. Anyway, let's just jump in now to the list, and we'll see how we go. Okay, starting with the Law of Wild over here. This is an exclusive to the Beastmen Law of Magic. No other faction can make use of it, and so in that regard, we need to take into consideration all the things that the Beastmen can do to boost this Law of Magic on campaign play, and how effective it is for their particular playstyle. Since none of the other factions use it, we don't have to worry about that. So looking at the spells that they do have, and let me just grab this. Okay, there are some good spells in here. So Devolve is just a basic debuff. It's okay. I'm not a big fan of debuff spells, but it's fairly cheap. Brace Scream is a low-powered breath attack. It's okay. I don't think it's an amazing spell. Vile Tide's an okay explosion spell. Don't think it's amazing. Traitorkin. This is like the key spell that I end up using with the Law of the Wilds. And I think that this is an amazing spell. Now, even on Ultra Unit scale, this direct damage spell is incredibly powerful. And you can get the Winds of Magic cost on this one down to something like 5 Winds of Magic for your Lords casters and 6 Winds of Magic for your Hero casters. Very, very powerful, because the AI has a tendency of blobbing up all their units. Just a really, really powerful spell that kills enemy entities quite significantly. Then we've got Mantle of Gorok. This one's okay. I would say this one's really good if you're rocking a big Minotaur-based army. And then we've got the Savage Dominion, which is pretty decent. You can reduce the Winds of Magic costs and actually end up getting 3 uses of it in battle. But it's pretty good for just like having a temporary siege caster or whatever. Siege weapon, essentially. Alright, so where would I place it though? I'd probably put it at A tier. A few months ago, I probably would have put it at like D or C tier, but given current Beastmen play, I'd say this is like the core Law of Magic for the Beastmen. Very good Law of Magic and essential for their playstyle if you want to do well. I mean, you don't have to ever recruit any Laws of Magic, but I highly recommended if you're going to play Beastmen, go with this. Very good Law of Magic. Next up, we've got the Law of Life. Okay, so looking at the Law of Life. Okay, going through their spells. We got Awakening of the Wood, which is a decent explosion spell. Earthblood, which is one of the most cost-effective heal spells in the game. Heals up to 4 entities at a time. Really good if you're rocking single entity armies. Flesh to Stone, which gives 60 armor, which I don't think is particularly good. Shield of Thorns, which is this is a much better buff spell, providing extra base weapon damage and 20% physical damage. Physical resistance. So that's a much better buff spell than Flesh to Stone, in my opinion. And then you've got Regrowth here, which is really good for an emergency situation to just heal up a unit. In terms of the Winds of Magic per hit point healed, Earthblood is better as long as you're healing like at least 3 entities, but if there's just like one person in your army that's just like really, really beat up, Overcasted Regrowth is really good. And then you've got the Dwellers Below here, which is a really good damaging spell. Now, every faction that can recruit the Law of Life can usually generate tons of Winds of Magic or have access to single entities, making it really effective for the factions that can handle it. So some notable examples of that are High Elves, Wood Elves, Empire, and Lizardmen. It's essential for the Lizardmen and Bretonia. There could be some others, I just can't remember them all off by heart. But those are like the key ones that get access to the Law of Life, and this is one of the best laws of magic in the game, going all the way up to S tier, possibly even the best law of magic in the game. But we'll discuss more of that a bit later. Next up is High Magic. Okay, going through the High Magic spells, we've got Hand of Glory, which in my opinion is garbage. Apotheosis, which is a decent heal spell, but it only heals one entity at a time. It's fairly cheap, but you know, it's a good heal spell. That's the primary reason I usually gonna use High Magic. Soul Quench is okay. It's a decent spell. Nothing spectacular. Tempest is garbage because it only really works well on units that are standing still, and generally speaking, the AI, unless you're in a siege situation, enemy flying units are usually rushing towards you, and because you have to target specific units, it doesn't hit where the unit is going to be, it hits where it is, and so the unit that's getting caught in the vortex is usually halfway out of the vortex by the time it hits. So this is bad to use against the AI on field battles. It might do better in multiplayer, I don't know, but generally speaking, you need to hit a sitting, a target that's just not doing anything. So really, really bad spell, this one. Fiery Convocation is a very powerful spell. The problem with this, it takes such a long time to cast this spell, and the AI is actually pretty decent at dodging it. So it's fairly expensive. If you can keep them locked in place and then use it, it's very powerful, but a tricky spell to master. And then we've got Arcane Unforgiving, which does it's basically a direct damage spell, but this is garbage. It's basically like an expensive Spirit Leech. It's primarily useful to stop characters that have really damaging abilities and just give you a bit of extra time to take them down. That would be the main reason for using it, but I usually just skip it and just focus on killing it rather than delaying their abilities. So in terms of where I would put the High Magic, I would probably put it at a C tier Law of Magic. It's just not very good. Alright, next up we got Dark Magic here. Alright, Dark Magic. Alright. Now, the two notable legendary lords that cast Dark Magic is Marathi and Malekith, and they can distort the perception of this Law of Magic quite significantly because they're really good casters on Dark Magic, right? But just the generic casters, that's sort of what we should somewhat evaluate this on, because Malekith can reduce the Winds of Magic cost on some of these spells by quite a bit. Same thing with Marathi. Okay, so same thing as well with Ariel, because she's got Dark Magic as well. Alright, Power of Darkness. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this particular spell because it consumes Winds of Magic to give you an arcane conduit, essentially, but the amount of power reserve that you get is temporary. So in a long-winded battle, this is not very good. But if you desperately need Winds of Magic in an emergency, that's when you would use it. So it's best to use this on a single entity, not on one of your infantry units, or use it on something that's of low value that doesn't really matter if it takes much damage. Like, for example, an artillery crew. Because the artillery still just operate just fine with a couple of these. But, you know, it's an iffy spell. Don't use it in all cases just because you've got it. Chill Wind is okay, just a decent sort of wind spell, I guess. It's okay. Not much to say about it. Does a bit of damage. If you cast it like 100 times in a battle, you can do a lot of damage. The AI is not particularly good at using it, and it's an okay Law of Magic. Word of Pain, it's okay. It's not amazing. It's just a debuff spell. Blade Wind is a Vortex spell. Now, Vortex spells are like the highest tier of the spells that I usually go for because the AI is very susceptible to getting smashed by Vortex spells. Now, there are some really big differences between amazing Vortex spells in this game and pretty lackluster ones. And I would say that Blade Wind is actually kind of a lackluster one. Usually, if you want to get any value out of it at all, you kind of have to overcast it. And on campaign play, I would be very wary about overcasting constantly because you end up killing your heroes quite a lot. At least I have really bad luck, generally speaking, so I'm just always miscasting whenever I overcast. So generally speaking, I try not to overcast. And this spell here, non-overcasted, it just doesn't last very long. Doesn't do that much damage, at least compared to other Lords of Magic. Doom Bolt is okay. You know, Doomfire Warlocks can use it as bounce spells, but it's a little bit on the expensive side. I don't think there's any main way of like reducing the Winds of Magic globally with Dark Elves, because that's their main Law of Magic. The Wood Elves also get access to it. And then there's Soul Stealer, which is a bit of a weird one because it's you place it on the ground, and it's supposed to steal hit points from the enemy entities and give it back to your caster. But that's not exactly how it works. It's a direct damage spell. You cast it on something, if it gets in there, it just does damage to it. And while that spell is active, your caster will regenerate hit points. The amount of entities that you're soul stealing from does not increase the amount of health regeneration. In fact, you can cast this on the ground and hit nothing, and your caster will still regenerate. So it's a little bit of a lazy spell, this one. It just doesn't do what you think it would do. So in terms of the Dark Lore of Magic, I'm gonna put it under C tier. Just not really a good Lore of Magic, in my opinion. Okay, next up, Lore of Ruin. Alright, this is an exclusive to the Skaven Lore of Magic. Let's go through these spells. So, alright, Grey Seers get access to a different lore, so, different spell. We'll go through that a bit. Okay, so, we got Howling Warp Gale. This is really good for Skaven. Really, really good, because they have trouble dealing with flying units. They don't have any flying units of their own. But this spell here, it acts as like a net for them. I usually overcast this one, because it is fairly cheap, and overcasting it gives you 28 seconds when they're pinned down. And because I use weapons teams, if I'm dealing with like a whole bunch of Pegasus Knights or Dragons or whatever, 28 seconds is more than enough time for a Rattling Gunner to absolutely obliterate any flying unit. So this is just really fits in with the Skaven roster. So good spell. Warp Lightning, really good spell, early game stuff. Just direct bombardment. AI is pretty good at using it. Does a lot of damage for its cost. Not the greatest spell in the game, but it's really easy to use, and that's what makes it good. Then we've got Death Frenzy, which is a buff spell. Since I don't really prioritize using melee infantry much as Skaven, I don't think this is a very good spell. But if you are using melee infantry, this is okay, I suppose, if you're doing Storm Vermin. Yeah, it's an okay spell. If you overcast it, you can get an increased effect range, so you can affect more than one unit, so that's pretty good, I guess, but I don't like it that much. Then you've got Scorch. Scorch just doesn't do that much damage. There's a few characters that are able to cast it essentially for free with bound spells, and you can cast it super cheap when you're playing as Clan Scryer. But it's an okay spell, doesn't do a lot of damage, but for its price, it's okay. Crack's Call. Crack's Call is kind of like a thicker, more powerful version of Scorch. It's a little bit expensive for what it does, but it is a very good damaging spell. And then you got Flensing Ruin here, which is garbage. This just doesn't do any damage. This is a terrible, terrible spell. It's extremely expensive. My recommendation is skip this spell entirely. I would only use this if the enemy army was entirely made up of single entities, because there's nothing else you could do to take them out, because that's primarily what it's good at doing, but for its cost, it's really not cost effective. And then with the Grey Seers, summoning the dreaded 13th spell, which summons a unit of Storm Vermin. It can either be Storm Vermin with shields or the Halberd variant. This is a really good spell, because it also causes an explosion around them, so if you time it really well, it can do a lot of damage. The Storm Vermin will have mixed results depending on how overwhelmed they are. They sometimes rout straight away, sometimes not, depends what they're going up against. But it's good at protecting the Grey Seer. So 20 Winds of Magic, or you can reduce it down a little bit more if you put more points into it, down to 18. It's a decent spell, but it does cost a lot. Generally speaking, though, the Skaven do have a lot of Winds of Magic. So, in terms of where I'm going to put the Lore of Ruin, I'm actually going to put it at... B or A? B or A? It's not S tier. I'm going to put it at A tier. I think it's a good Lore of Magic for the... yeah, you should have it in each of your armies, and you can... Yeah, I'm going to go with A tier. Okay, then we'll go with the Lore of Plague. Okay, so Plague Magic... Going through their spells. Alright, we've got Blessed with Filth. So, this one here is just a real simple debuff. It just causes poison attacks. But, if you're running with a weapons team army, this spell here can be really good. Because, with the Rattling Guns, right? You've got the spell that... Sorry, with Rattling Guns, they cause, like, suppressing fire. So, they reduce the speed. But if they also do poison effect as well, you can reduce it by an additional 15%, and then the passive from the Lore of Plague also reduces their speed. So if you want to really bog the enemy down, this is a really good spell, and you can put it down on your artillery as well. And it does last a good amount of time, and you can get it fairly cheap. Then you got Pestilent Breath, which is really good against low tier crap. It does a ton of damage. I wouldn't use it against armored units, but against low tier stuff with not much armor, it's really effective at doing damage. Also, another thing with Skaven is that you use Pestilent Breath to kill your own units so that you can warp bomb them. Really, really effective if you're going to play that way, which I do. Then Vermintide. This is like the key spell that I get the Lore of Plague for. Well, actually, one of the 2 key spells I get the Lore of Plague for. For field battles, Vermintide's the way to go. You just have a bunch of Plague Priests summoning loads and loads of Vermintides, and that's your melee infantry. You just hold the enemy back for as long as possible so that your artillery just bombard the crap out of them. Really, really good cost-effective spell. Then you've got Wither, which is a debuff that just causes armor reduction. Not really a big fan of it, so I don't think it's a good spell at all. But you don't need to make use of every single spell. Then we've got Plague over here. Now this is one of the best Vortex spells in the game. It's a standing still one, so it doesn't move around randomly, and this does so much damage that it can take out almost an entire unit with one cast, even a dwarf unit that's got magic resistance. It's also really good at taking out armored cavalry. It's just really, really good for sieges. Just casting this constantly during a siege will win you 90% of the battle. This is their key spell for sieges, where Vermintide is the key spell for field battles. Then you've got Pestilent Birth, which is kind of like just an upgraded version of Vermintide. I kind of consider it kind of like the overcasted version. You only get 2 casts, it is quite expensive, so I usually just use this once I've run out of Vermintides, just to get just some more summons if I'm in a really desperate situation. And then, of course, the Grey Seers can summon the dreaded 13th spell as well, so that's a Grey Seer specific spell. Now, in terms of where I'm going to place the Lore of Plague, that is an S tier Lore of Magic. It is absolutely amazing. Highly recommended getting it. Then we've got the Lore of Eshin. Okay, kind of want to get through these a little bit faster. Otherwise, it's going to take too long. Okay, Lore of Eshin. Skitterleap. Not a big fan of it. Gives extra speed. It's a bit of a buff. Just not a big fan of the spell. This one here is okay. You can get it quite cheap. Doesn't do a lot of damage, but for its cost, it's okay. It's fairly micro-intensive though, but it's good for like if you're running around trying to assassinate a single entity. That can be quite useful. Then you've got Armor of Darkness, which I'm not a big fan of. Getting extra 20% missile resistance and 60 armor. It's okay. It's just I'm not a big fan of buff spells, so those buffs are just they're okay. They're just not amazing. You know, obviously it's pretty self-explanatory what they do. Then you've got Veil of Shadows. So this one here, this is a bit of a weird one. It's a vortex spell that is good for just pushing units out of the way. It's fairly expensive and it doesn't do any damage. So this is kind of okay if you were using a weapons team army and you put this down during a choke point to hold the enemy back. But the thing is, the Lore of Plague has a spell that does that way cheaper, which is just the Vermintide spell. So I just think you've got better choices with that one. Then you've got Brittle Bone here, which, again, just another debuff spell. Just not a huge fan of debuffs, and this debuff is like minus 40 melee defense is fine, but I don't prioritize using melee infantry as a Skaven, so I just feel like this is not a good fit for optimal play with Skaven. Then we've got Black Whirlwind. This is a vortex spell that stands still. It's kind of like a more expensive version of Plague that doesn't quite do as much damage, so I just usually don't get the Lore of Stealth. So I'm gonna place the Lore of Stealth at D tier. This is a garbage Lore of Magic because it actually uses up the same skill unit cap as or hero cap as the Lore of Plague. I would never get an Eshin Sorcerer over a Plague Priest. They're just vastly a better unit. The only reason I ever get them, if I am going to get them, is because the trait Knowledgeable showed up. But apart from that, I would just never get it. Just possibly the worst Lore of Magic in the game, in my opinion. Just utter rubbish. Okay, next up, speaking of rubbish, here we have the Lore of Nehekara. Alright, Lore of Nehekara, which is exclusive to the Tomb Kings. This is not a good Lore of Magic, but let's go through it. So, we've got the Jaf's Incantation of Cursed Blades, which, giving your garbage units extra 25% damage is kind of crap. It is very cheap, but like, it's like garbage in, garbage up, garbage out. It's just, you're buffing garbage units. It's just not really a good fit, even in the early game, or late game, any time of the game. It's just not a great spell. Then we've got the Neru's Incantation of Protection. It's okay. Overcasting it gives you an effect, extended effect duration, 40% physical resistance. I don't know. I just don't think it's very good. It's a buff spell. like, you're buffing garbage units in the first place. Generally speaking, like, you can buff garbage units to make them better, but you gotta throw in a lot of garbage a lot of these spells. And the thing is, the Tomb Kings, in my opinion, just that they've got better choices. Alright, next up we've got Petrar's Incantation of Righteous Smiting. This is a garbage spell. So we've got extra missile weapon strength. So this one here is the melee buff. This one here is the missile buff. But you only buff one unit. Giving your archers extra 40% damage. I just don't think it's worth that much cost. You want to be doing damage with your actual spells, because it doesn't last that long, and you're not going to do much damage with them in the first place. So just kind of, it's just a shit spell. All right, then we've got Assyrian's Incantation of Vengeance. Okay, this one's okay. I find this one's good against cavalry, or good-ish against cavalry. My biggest problem with it is that it's kind of expensive. Probably one of the less worst spells in this Law of Magic. It does a decent amount of damage. It's sort of like the equivalent of a Spirit Leech, but also being more expensive. Alright, then we've got the Sekhmet's Incantation of the Skullstorm, which is its Vortex spell. Now, I have tried so hard to make excuses for the spell. Oh, it's cheap. Come on, we can make it work. But every single time I use it, it it moves around faster than other Vortex spells. And even when you overcast it, the 27-second duration, it very rarely stays actually where you want it to be. It just goes away. So because it moves around so much and it actually doesn't do that much damage, this is kind of a garbage spell. Even for its relatively cheap price for a Vortex spell, it just isn't very good. It's one of the worst Vortex spells in the game. I tried so hard to make it work, and it just wouldn't do as well as the other ones. Alright, then we've got Uskep's Incantation of Desiccation. You gotta give them A+ for effort for the names, though, for these spells. This one here, I would say, is the only decent debuff spell in the Law of Nehekara. It is on the expensive side, but considering that you generally speaking don't want your units to die super quickly, and that sometimes as the Tomb Kings you will end up in a blob, the effect range of 40 meters, it's one of the only ones that actually has an effect range of 40 meters in this Law of Magic. It is actually fairly decent. It's a decent debuff as well. Reducing their melee attack and melee defense by 24 is pretty significant. It's just a little bit pricey. But overall, the Law of Nehekara is trash, garbage, D-ranked, just total crap. Don't like it at all. It used to be a little bit better when you used to be able to cheese the passive spell, the passive ability a little bit, but it's more tricky to do that now, so I don't even bother. So you've got better Laws of Magic as the Tomb King, so I just don't bother with it at all anymore. All right, next up, Law of Deeps. Okay, it took a little while for me to get my head around this one, but let's go through it. All right, Spiteful Shot. Rubbish. Giving magic damage and extra accuracy on your units is actually total crap, because accuracy, generally speaking, only matters when you're shooting into single entities. If you're shooting into a massive infantry and you don't quite hit the right target, well, you probably hit the person right next to it anyway. So accuracy is not an important stat. Now, magical damage can be very useful if you're going up against an ethereal unit, but apart from that, I wouldn't bother with it. Just not really a great spell. Luckily, it's got other things going for it. Okay, then you've got Tide Call over here, which is like a decent breath attack. It's kind of the equivalent of a what's this one called again? The Pestilent Breath. Yeah, it's basically the equivalent of that. Good cheap spell. Does a bit of damage. Fog of the Damned, debuff spell. Does have a bit of an effect range, even when not overcasting it. It's okay. It also debuffs their leadership. It's okay. It's not a bad spell, I think. For a debuff. Yeah, not great on legendary difficulty because, generally speaking, the leadership debuffs are less valuable because you've got further to go. I should say very high battle difficulty, not necessarily legendary. I just usually assume that if you're playing legendary, you're playing very hard. That's not always the case. Then you've got Denizens of the Deep, which summons a unit of Rotting Prometheans up to twice. Which is okay. It's good at holding the lines for a little bit. They kind of get in the way of your gunners a bit, so I'm not a huge fan of it. I think that there's definitely better sort of summons for sure, but it's okay at best. It's an okay spell. Kraken's Pull, Vortex spell stationary. It does do a bit of damage. It's a little bit on the expensive side. AI is fairly good at dodging it sometimes. I think it's okay. Then we've it's been tricky to sort of get like a lot of damage done with this one. It doesn't do a ton. Okay, then we've got Vanguard's Revenge. Now this one here is kind of like Wind of Death, which we haven't covered Vampire yet, so we'll get to that. But this is the best spell in the Lore of Deep, and pretty much the saving grace for it, and the reason why that this Lore of Magic is actually going to end up in A tier because of this particular spell here. It takes a little while to cast, but it does a ton of damage. It's really good in sieges. This is actually really good for the Vampire Coast. If you can manage to pin enemy units down with this spell, and if you've got enough Winds of Magic to also cast Vanguard's Revenge, can do a ton of damage with it. But because it takes a long time to cast, sometimes the AI moves out of the way. Okay, so moving on to the Little War. Okay, where's that? Little War. Okay, so there's a big difference in the effectiveness of this Lore of Magic, whether you're using a Lord or a Hero. My recommendation is don't bother recruiting the Hero variant, the Goblin Shaman Hero. But if you're recruiting the Lord, the Great Goblin Shaman, that is very much recommended. That's the meta hero to use for the greenskins, because when you get it to rank, I think 18 or 14, I can't remember exactly, they get an Arachnarok mount, the Catchweb Spider Shrine mount, and that reduces the Winds of Magic and cooldown on all these spells by a dramatic amount, making all of these spells really, really effective and really cheap. Okay, so going through them, we got Sneaky Stabbin'. It's okay. My biggest problem with this one is that it only affects one unit. If it affected an area effect, it would be really good, but it is really cheap. Vindictive Glare. You can end up getting the Winds of Magic cost down to like 2 on this. It's for its price, it's just cheap magic missile, so it's a decent spell. But I wouldn't like put all your hopes and dreams on it. Then we've got Gork Will Fix It, which is, I'm not a big fan of the spell. The primary use is to slow enemy units down. It's fairly cheap, so it's not that bad. Itchy Nuisance, this is a really good debuff spell, reducing their base weapon damage and their melee attack. You can get it really cheap, so it's just really good to just make your enemies just not hit you quite as hard. So really, really good spell, that one. I quite like it. Not usually a fan of debuffs, but for its price, it's just really effective, and affects the area effect, and it lasts a good long while, so good spell. Night Shroud, hate it. Causing Stalk and Unspottable for a temporary amount of time, I just don't think it's very useful. You're much better off having a unit that's actually making use of stalking permanently. So for 11 Winds of Magic, I just think that's an absolute rubbish spell. And then we've got Curse of the Bad Moon, which is a tricky spell to use because it moves around quite randomly, but it can do a fair amount of damage. But you can get the Winds of Magic cost down to this to like 6 on a Catchweb Shrine mount. So you just keep casting it constantly throughout the battle, and it also causes some debuffs. Now, the thing is here, if you accidentally hit your own units with it, you don't inflict the debuff on them, which is pretty nice. I mean, you're killing your own troops, but at least you're not inflicting that debuff. So I think that's like the core spell that I use. Usually Curse of the Bad Moon and Itchy Nuisance are the core spells there. So I'm going to put the Little War as an A tier Lore of Magic. Moving on to the Big War. Alright, so we also need to make a distinction here that Wurzag is an amazing spellcaster of Big War, because Foot of Gork is really powerful, and the fact that he can cast it for 6 Winds of Magic is absolutely insane. But just because one legendary lord can cast it really well doesn't mean that it's necessarily a great Lore of Magic. We've got to judge it for the other the spellcaster that you'll be using through a long campaign, probably more of than Wurzag, depending. The Orc Shaman. Alright, so we got Gaze of Mork here, which is similar sort of effectiveness as Vindictive Glare, it's just the Big War variant. Brainburster, which is good explosion spell, does a bit of damage, not amazing. Fist of Gork imbues magic damage and provides a pretty significant buff. Can't be overcasted, so it's only for 1 unit. I'm not a big fan of buffs that only affect 1 unit. I just don't think they provide much value. Edbutt, sort of a breath spell it does a bit of damage, not very good against armored units. Not much to note about it. Here we go. This is a good buff spell, especially if you're in a blob. Effect range 40 meters and 40 melee attack. This gives you so much killing power. If you've got a Big War and a Little War spellcaster, you pop down the Foot of the Here We Go on your troops, and the itchy nuisance on their troops, and they're doing no damage to you, and you're just eating through them. And if you can time that with the actual War ability, man, you just absolutely eat right through them. But that requires pretty damn good timing. And then you've got Foot of Gork here, this explosion spell. This is an incredibly powerful spell and really good for against the dwarfs, which is like your primary enemy, and Wurzag just does an amazing job with it because there's only 6 winds of magic for him, which is so damn cheap. Everybody else can cast it for as low as 15 winds of magic, which is a decent price, but it can be a little bit on the pricey side if you don't have a lot of winds of magic in any particular battle. But it can do a ton of damage. So for that reason, the Big War is also going to be an A tier of Lore of Magic. I would say that you should try to have one of each of these casters in your armies as the greenskins to suit whatever needs that you need. Good Laws of Magic. Okay, then we've got the Lore of Light over here. Lots of factions can access the Lore of Light. It's primarily good for archer-based armies because of the Net of Emmetok, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay, so we've got Fast Protection. Now, I would overcast the spell. It's a good buff, but you got to be careful with constantly overcasting things. It's fairly cheap and gives you the added effect range if you overcast it. Decent spell. Shem's Burning Gaze. This on paper is okay, but my biggest problem with it is because it causes fire damage. Most like units that you kind of want to kill with this spell tend to have some kind of fire resistance, so it actually gives more ways to block it. So I find that this has very few units that you can actually use this against and actually do a lot of damage, and it's a little bit on the expensive side for a that's okay, I guess. 5 winds of magic, I don't know, overcast. It's okay, Lore of Magic. Sorry, it's an okay spell there. Then we've got Light of Battle. I actually don't really like this spell at all. It gives your units unbreakable, right? Which, on paper, that seems okay. But the thing is, if you cast this on a unit that's already broken, it doesn't rally them. And sometimes the time that you need to cast a spell is too late before it's actually done. If it was cast instantly, it'd be a lot better. But sometimes, you know, you only get it like a second before something is wavering to broken. And if you cast it too soon, well, then you're wasting the duration. So if you cast it on a unit that isn't immediately about to break, this is completely useless. And for 7 winds of magic, I just think you got better options. Net of Emmetok, really good spell, especially for archer-based army. You just overcasting it is the primary way to use it because you want that effect range, 30 meters, to just bog down as many units as possible for 20 seconds so you can shoot the shit out of them. Really good spell, the primary reason that we use this. Now, you wouldn't get the Lore of Light if you weren't running with an archer-based army. I think this is better uses for it. If you were using a melee-based army, then you've got the Barona's Time Warp, which is actually a really good buff spell as well, and you don't need to overcast. A duration 50 seconds for 40 meter effect range, 24 extra melee attack and some extra speed. Really good spell, actually. I just usually don't use a whole bunch of melee units for it unless I'm playing Tomb Kings, and this is the Lore of Magic to use as the Tomb Kings. And because you have so many variant armies as the Tomb Kings, this spell I actually use quite a bit with them. And then you've got the Banishment spell here, which, comparing it to the Nehekara spell, this one here is the way to go. It's a bit more expensive than this spell here, but this one does a ton of damage and it doesn't move very much, so it's quite reliable. It's sort of like a mid-range in terms of cost. You can get the Winds of Magic cost down to 15. So overall, I think this is a really good Lore of Magic. So much so that I'm actually going to put it as an S tier Lore of Magic. It doesn't have all the best spells. It was borderline A tier. I would actually classify this one as one of the top 5 Laws of Magic, which I did a long time ago, put in that video. And I still think that way, but maybe my opinion has dropped on it just a little bit because some of the other Laws of Magic have sort of crept up a little bit. Alright, then we've got the Lore of Heavens. Now, this is a Lore of Magic that was on my top 5 list a long time ago, but I probably wouldn't put it on the top 5 list anymore. So let's go through it. We've got Harmonic Convergence, which only affects one unit. Overcasting it just gives you extra armor, which I don't think is worth it at all. 30 extra armor for a miscast chance is not worth it. So I don't think this is a great spell. Useful if you're relying on one unit to win the battle for you, which is very rare on campaign play. At least not in the mid game. Maybe in the early game it's okay. Then we've got Wind Blast. This is a pretty cost-effective wind spell. I'd say it's one of the better ones in the game. You know, equivalent sort of to the Pestilent Breath. Same sort of cost. It's just just the same sort of thing. We've already gone through that kind of spell. Irana's Thunderbolt, which is a good bombardment spell, fairly cheap, good for sieges as well. So you can cast this on the walls, damage the walls and kill units on there. You have to cast it a fair few times. It does say it's good against artillery pieces, but I found that you have to cast it twice on an artillery piece in order to actually destroy it. So if it's got 4 artillery pieces, then you may have to cast it 8 times, which is just too long to have to worry about it. But if you're going up against like a hell cannon, that could be quite useful, but of course you got to get in range of it. Curse of the Midnight Wind is actually one of my favorite debuff spells in the game, because it's relatively cheap, it's got a decent debuff, and it's got a good effect range that we don't need to overcast it. 25 seconds is a good amount of duration. I quite like the Curse of the Midnight Wind. Decent spell. Then you've got Comet of Cassandora. Now, I used to think that this spell here was a piece of crap, but now I actually think it's quite good, especially if you overcast it, because it used to not count the kills properly. But if you get a nice big blob going, getting an overcasted Comet of Cassandora can get so many kills. The only problem with it is that it's a little bit on the expensive side. That's about it. I would not cast this spell on units that are not pinned down, because they will dodge it. Then you've got one of the better Vortex spells in the game, Chain Lightning, because it's relatively cheap, especially if you're casting it with Techless. And it lasts a good long while. 21 seconds for 14 Winds of Magic, or you can drop it down, I think, to 11 Winds of Magic. Or maybe that's with Techless. Maybe it's 12 Winds of Magic. I can't remember. I use Techless so much I can't remember what the normal Winds of Magic is now for it. But yeah, you can get the Winds of Magic cost down a fair bit, and 21 seconds on it is pretty good for it. It does move around a fair bit, but it does a lot of damage. Overall, I'm going to put the Law of Heavens at A tier. I used to put it at S tier, but I think it's A tier now. Next up, Law of Fire. This is one of my favorite Law of Magics, and I would say this is arguably the most destructive Law of Magic in the game. This is a good one. All right, so going through its spells. Not all of the spells are amazing, but let's go through them. So Cascading Fire Cloak, I don't think this is a great spell. I usually just skip it. It's just a buff spell, really. Just don't bother with it. Fireball, not a big fan of it. It's okay in the early game. Good at taking out low-level lords fairly cheaply. You can get it down to 4 Winds of Magic. It's okay. This one here is quite useful for when you're running an archer-based army and you're going up against something with a lot of physical resistance or weak against fire, because you imbue magic damage and fire damage and increase the amount of missile damage. I don't usually use it on melee units, and it also has an effect range. You can get it fairly cheap, so it's an okay spell, but it's sort of like one that you'll very rarely use. Burning Head is a really good early game spell. When you're going up against mass numbers of orcs or whatever, this is just great for just getting rid of huge swaths of enemies, as long as they don't have too much armor. If they do have a lot of armor, overcasting it will, generally speaking, keep you covered. Another thing which is really good for it, which is probably better for lower difficulty ratings, that if you're just on the cusp of breaking them and then you use the Burning Head, you can drop their leadership just enough to break them. So that can be really effective in that sort of situation. So it's got a lot of purpose, this one. Then we've got the Piercing Bolts of Burning. This is a decent spell, but it's the same sort of problem that the Comet of Cassandora has. You don't want to be casting it on a unit that isn't pinned down, because this is a spell that the AI is very good at dodging. But if they're pinned down, they'll usually suck it up. Now, this spell here is pretty damn good at taking out large entities. So if you're going up against a Dreadsaurian, and if you can manage to just keep it still, so if you use a Net of Amantok on it first and then overcast this will do a ton of damage to it, whereas there's very few spells in the game that's actually good against large entities, at least in terms of doing damage. The general rule of thumb when casting spells is that if you're going up against single entities or large units, use debuffs. If you're going up against infantry, use damage spells. That's a general rule of thumb, not in every single case though. Then Flamestorm. Okay, Flamestorm is the best Vortex spell in the game, bar none. It does the most amount of damage, it's the cheapest, it lasts the longest. You can overcast it to get even more, but you just don't need to. This one is a city killer. This can wipe out garrisons so easily. You cast it underneath a wall if you want to use exploits. It just burns everyone on the wall. You get it for only 10 Winds of Magic, or the high elves can cast it for like 8, and you just get so much bang for your buck. It does so much damage. The only thing that is not going to kill are things with extreme amounts of fire resistance. So for example, Iron Drakes. But apart from that, just butchers everyone. It's good against cavalry, it's good against infantry, it's not good against single entities, but no Vortex spells are. So the Law of Fire is getting S tier. Really good Law of Magic. and definitely in my top 5. Next up, Law of Death. Okay. So, this is the sort of the law of magic when I use it as an example for when small unit scale is really imbalanced, because Spirit Leech on ultra unit scale, which is what I'm basing this on, is garbage in most cases. It's actually really bad at sniping lords unless they've got like low health, like for example a Banshee. But most lords, this is just really not cost effective. But on small unit scale it is. So Aspect of the Dread Knight, it's okay. Can cause fear and terror, gives magic damage. It's not great. I sometimes forget the spell even exists, but it can be sometimes useful for just causing a little bit of extra morale damage. But if you really want to do morale damage, what you want is Doom and Darkness. Now this is really good for stinky armies, if you know what I'm talking about, for ones that their whole purpose is to lower enemy leadership. So for example, if you're going with Dread Incarnate for vampire accounts, then popping down a Death Wizard that has this can be really effective, because you get the leadership down so much, and then you just use this to just kick them off the edge. Really good for that. So, bit of a off usage, and kind of relying on exploits if you're going to do that. Not really exploits, more like cheese. But it's an okay spell if that's where you're going to use your strategies around. Soul Blight is okay. It reduces their armor, reduces their damage. It's a decent debuff. It's fairly cheap. It does an area of effect range, so it's okay. I don't mind that one. Now, Purple Sun of Xerius. This one here is arguably one of the most damaging vortexes in the game. My problem with it is that it's expensive. So you can get the Winds of Magic cost down to it from 18 to 16, but also only lasts 11 seconds. Now, it's still more cost effective than this Sekhmet's Incantation of the Skullstorm, but it is less effective than pretty much most of the other Vortex spells that I've spoken about, especially Flamestorm and Chain Lightning and Banishment. All of them, I think, are more effective than the Purple Sun, but it is very damaging for the short time that it's there. And then you've got Fate of Bajuna, which is garbage. It is just too expensive. It's basically a Spirit Leech variant if you want to take out a cavalry unit, which casting this once will basically wipe out a cavalry unit for the most part, especially on like normal unit scale and below. But for the Winds of Magic cost, it is just way too expensive for what it does, especially if you're playing on ultra unit scale. So this one here, this Law of Magic, where it's placed on this largely depends on what unit scale. If you're playing on small unit scale, it's actually S tier, but for ultra unit scale, which I'm basing this on, I'm actually going to rank it as B tier, because it's not a bad Law of Magic, but it is definitely not a great Law of Magic. It's sort of middle of the rung. Next up, Vampire Magic. Okay, now this is arguably one of the best Laws of Magic in the game, and kind of my favorite. This Law of Magic here has just got something for everyone. Okay, so we've got Van Hel's Dance Macabre. Overcasting this, so you can get area of effect range. Really good. Extra melee attacks. It's really good if you're using it on a blob. But also, I don't really use this spell very much. But it is a good spell. I just don't use it because I use other spells. Then we've got the Invocation of Nehek. One of the most cost-effective healing spells in the game. Overcasting it can heal up to 4 entities. I usually don't overcast it just because I don't want my casters miscasting ever, because I tend to cast like tons of spells as the vampires, or as Vampire Council Coast. But it is a really good spell, overcasted or not. Then Raise the Dead, such a good spell. It's like the cheapest summon spell. Now, I usually summon zombies, not summon skeletons, just because the zombies actually kind of last longer, and they're just really cost effective. But having flying units fly over and dropping zombies down on the enemy, this is just such a great spell. Really, really good for the vampire count. So much utility. You don't need these guys to do damage. It's just about keeping the enemy locked in place so you can do other things, because it's just so cheap. Gaze of Nagash. Not a great magic missile. I usually don't do it. It's just not cost effective for the amount of damage it does. Its primary usage is basically to take out gyro bombers. Apart from that, I just wouldn't do it. Curse of Years, good debuff spell. Relatively cheap. Also causes increase in ability recharge. This is really good if you're dealing with nasty skulkers, because you really don't... Sorry, not nasty skulkers. Goblin fanatics, because you really don't want them using their twirly whirlies before they've actually... died, because once they're down to 25% health, they can't cast it anymore. But it's a decent debuff, but that's not the primary spell that I use. The primary spell I use in this Law of Magic, it all comes down to the Wind of Death. Probably the biggest killer of units in the game, at least in terms of my playthroughs. My entire campaign play around vampire counts is using this spell. It's basically around just locking the enemy infantry in place, and then just killing them with Wind of Death. It's extremely expensive. There's a lot of characters that can reduce it by quite a bit. I think Heinrich Kemmler is now the best caster of Wind of Death. It used to be Helmut Gorst. And you just get so many kills with this. I think my record for one cast was 1,400 kills in a single overcasted cast with Wind of Death. Now, this is the thing. You really want to make sure you overcast the spell, because it doubles the damage for only a tiny additional cost of Winds of Magic. You do have a chance of miscasting, but the great thing about the Undead is that you've got plenty of other options here to heal. And there's a lot of things you can do to reduce the miscast chance anyway. But Winds of Death is arguably one of the best spells in the game, which is primarily why this is getting the S tier rank. And I'll reorganize the S tier ones into which ones I think is the actual best within the S tiers at the end of the video. Okay, we got 4 Laws of Magic next. Law of Metal. Now, Law of Metal. It's important to note, I guess, hang on, just briefly, this is just like Gorst's Laws of Magic, or that's the Vampire Coast one. This, I don't know, that spell's okay. That's basically a replacement of the Raise the Dead. I just want to briefly mention that. They're just summon spells, they're not really a big deal. Then we've got, yeah, Law of Metal, that's what we're working on here. So, first up, Plague of Rust. I don't think it's very good. Reducing armor. Gelt can get it down to 0 Winds of Magic. I think it's important to note as well that this Law of Magic is primarily identified with Gelt. There are other casters that you can get in the game, like generic casters that can use this Law of Magic, but Gelt is like the headliner for the Law of Metal. Now, Gelt reduces the Winds of Magic cost on all Law of Metal spells by a ridiculous amount. So, for him, Law of Metal is really good. But the base for every other spellcaster's Law of Metal is actually really kind of bad. Because Law of Metal is, generally speaking, very expensive with very low impact. So, Searing Doom, you can see here, like 6 Winds of Magic cost, this is without any additional points. You get down to like 4. Like, Gelt can cast it for 1 Winds of Magic, but other ones can only cast it for 4. So, Gelt casts it for 25% the cost of other spellcasters. So, Gelt is an amazing caster with spell, but other ones just not so much. Glittering Robe, giving extra armor. I just don't value armor boosts, especially temporary ones, that much. Even if it is relatively cheap, I just don't think it's a lot of value, because so many units just have a lot of armor piercing, which just bypasses completely. You're so much better off having physical or magic resistance. Gehenna's Golden Hounds is okay, especially good with Gelt, because he can cast it for 2 Winds of Magic, but everyone else has to cast it for like 6 Winds of Magic, I think, and it's just not an effect, it's like a cheap Vortex spell, and for its price it's okay, but you have to constantly keep casting it. It moves randomly, less reliably so than Flamestorm. It's just really difficult to get a lot of kills out of that, especially in the late campaign. It's good in the early games, but it also has a problem of, like, if you're casting it close to your only troops, because it moves around quite randomly, it's hard to control it. It does tend to backfire on you a fair bit, so I'm not a huge fan of it. It's good with Gelt though. Transmutation of Lead is a decent debuff spell, but for any factions that have access to the Law of Metal, which I think it's Empire, but only for Gelt, Norska and Chaos, I think they both have Law of Metal. You just don't really need these debuffs, really. So I just don't think it's particularly useful. And then you've got Final Transmutation. Now, on paper, this is a great spell. Does a lot of damage. I just think it's way too expensive. Gelt does it quite cheaply compared to other ones, but I just think for its price, it's just way too expensive. So I don't think the Law of Metal is like super bad, but I'm gonna put it under C tier. I just don't think it's a great Law of Magic. It's too expensive for what it does. Moving on, we've got the Law of Shadows. Okay, Law of Shadows. Alright, so we've got Melkoth, Mystifying Miasma. There are so many factions that actually have use of Shadow Magic, so it's hard to really go over every instance of it, but one thing that comes to mind is like Marathi. Marathi's very good with the Shadow Magic spells that she does have, but I'm just going to rate this based off just generic wizards, right? Because like half the factions in the game have the Law of Shadows. It's probably one of the most common. Okay, so Melkoth, Mystifying Miasma. Decent spell, it's cheap, it's really good against cavalry for its price point. Reducing their speed is an added bonus, but it's decent for dishing out damage, especially if you just don't have anything else going on for you. Enfeebling Foe is okay as a debuff spell. You can You can't cast it on multiple targets at a time. It's okay. It's not great. I don't really value things that don't have an area of effect very highly. The Withering, again, another debuff. It does have an effect range if you overcast it, but I just don't value it that much. I guess this is good if you can recruit a Death Wizard and a Shadow Wizard and use the Withering as well as Doom and Darkness to like double up on the effect a little bit. So that can be quite useful, but I usually don't use that very much. Penumbral Pendulum, good spell. I quite like it. Fairly reliable, good if the enemy's pinned down, does a lot of damage. Very good in the early game, not overly expensive, just a good win spell. Then you got Occam's Mind Razor. Decent spell if you really need the extra magic damage, and it does provide a fair bit of weapon strength, but you have to overcast it if you want to get the extra effect range, and that's a little bit expensive, so not an amazing spell. I don't know, it's okay. But the main spell within the Lore of Shadows that I recommend using is the Pit of Shades. This one here, overcasted, is incredibly powerful. So the only thing I would urge people to be cautious about with it is overcasting too much can kill your heroes, especially if you're playing on small unit scale, because the amount of overcast damage actually hurts you way more on small unit scale. You basically shouldn't ever overcast if you're playing on small unit scale. But anyway, if you unless you got like loads of magic resistance, because the magic feedback is actually magic damage. But anyway, the Pit of Shades, really good spell, stationary, sort of the equivalent of Skaven Plague spell. Good at also pinning them down. So really good spell actually, the Pit of Shades. Then you've got some other ones here from other characters that also have access to it. It's kind of weird seeing life magic in here, but that's because there's various heroes that have access to shadow and life magic. So where would we rank shadow magic? I would put that as B tier. I think it's good, just like maybe B tier, but like above death a little bit. Okay, we're leaving the best to last here. We got Beast Wizard. Alright, Beast Magic. Here we go. Get ready for some spicy takes here. Alright. I have previously said that Beast Magic is the worst lore of magic in the game. Does that still hold true? Find out now. Okay, Wissand's Wild Form. I don't like this spell. I just don't like it. I just don't think the buffs are particularly good. Providing extra weapon strength if you in effect range if you overcast it. I just think it's just low impact. Flock of Doom. I like Flock of Doom now. I used to not really like it too much because it didn't inflict a lot of kills, but it inflicts a lot of damage. I've actually gotten some pretty clutch wins thanks to Flock of Doom, and two characters that come to mind that are amazing Flock of Doomers are Malagor primarily and Teclis. That's like their primary spells. I used to use Teclis just for Chain Lightning. Now I use him a lot for Flock of Doom, and Malagor's Flock of Dooms is just insane. It's like 2 winds of magic, just casting it constantly. This is the best spell in the Lore of Beasts. And if it wasn't for this spell, maybe it would be actually the worst Lore of Magic. And maybe it is. Hang on. Maybe it is. We'll see. But that's its best spell. The Amber Spear. This is a spell that's really good if you're playing on smaller unit scales. It can be a little bit finicky and has a pretty good chance of missing on moving targets, because the thing is, it's great to shoot at something that's just standing still, but chances are that the AI is usually coming at you. So, and if you do cast it on a stationary enemy, then they're going to come after you right after that. I have seen on the Reddit that somebody was able to like delete an entire unit with one cast of the Amber Spear, but that unit was standing completely still. That's just such an unusual situation for it to occur. Pan's Impenetrable Pelt is a good buff spell if you overcast it. 20% physical resistance, it's not too expensive, it's okay. Extra melee defense, it's just an okay buff spell. The Curse of Vandra here is okay, don't need to overcast it. It's got a good amount of debuff. Funny thing about this one here is that for the price point, what it does is very similar to Uskep's Incantation of Desiccation, but it's way cheaper, except this one here does last way longer. But I don't mind the Curse of Vandra here, it's okay. And then we've got the Transformation of Cadon, which if you're playing as High Elves, I believe it summons a eagle, or maybe that's if you're playing as Wood Elves, summons an eagle, but everyone else summons Manticores. I'm glad they fixed the audio problem with that because it used to be too loud. The problem with it is that it doesn't last very long. This used to be the best spell in the Law of Magic because it would be permanent. This was back in Warhammer 1 days. But now this spell just doesn't last very long and it's kind of too expensive for what it does. So it's good if you need it in a desperate situation, but the primary spell to use in the Law of Beasts is actually Flock of Doom. Now, where are we putting this? Find out after we talk about the Law of Rune Magic. Leave this for last. Okay, so Law of Runes. Now, it's actually got an entry here. Now, this can barely even be considered a Law of Magic because it doesn't use Winds of Magic. However, it does have an entry here. So does Deliverance of Itza, but you know, explosion. It's not really worth mentioning. All right, going through the runes. Let's go through that first, and then I'll talk about the inherent problem with rune magic. Okay, Rune of Negation. This rune here was nerfed significantly in the latest patch. It used to be 44% damage reduction in an area of effect. Now it's only one person. Now, that wouldn't be a problem if it didn't also cause a cooldown on all of your other all of the other runes that you've got after you've casted it. So you can only cast one thing at a time. And even if you're playing as Thorak Ironbrow and you get all the debuffs you can, you still have to wait a good long while after you cast just one thing. And that's a big problem for the runic magic, is that you don't end up making use of all of the runes usually. You only ever make use of like one rune over and over again because it's the only one that's worth doing. And it's not Rune of Negation. Rune of Oath and Steel, garbage. Extra 30 armor on units that have above 100 armor or above 80 armor. What's the point? Like, the only thing that's going to hurt them at that point is armor piercing, so extra armor. You're just doubling down on stuff that just isn't important to do. So, just kind of useless. I just don't like Rune of Oath and Steel. Rune of Wrath and Ruin. So, this is interesting because it used to do damage, direct damage, and then it was a speed debuff, and now it's back to being a damage spell. And it doesn't do that much damage as an explosion spell. It's good in a siege because it doesn't have ammunition, so you can use it unlimited amount of times, but you have to have an extreme amount of patience to do it. So I actually hate doing it. And this is for someone that will spend 2 hours in a battle if it means I can win it. I don't like using the Rune of Wrath and Ruin. It's not really good to use in the heat of battle, because it just doesn't do that much damage compared to other Lords of Magic. Not that the Dwarfs can actually get that, but it's not as good as what people think it is. Rune of Breaking. I don't like this at all. You can overcast runes now, but honestly, this is garbage. Absolute garbage. Extra weapon strength, but debuffing, but causing a delay on all your other ones. It's just not worth it. I don't think I ever used this. Just 100% not worth it, in my opinion. Rune of Speed. I like this one because, and it's like the most basic one as well, so the tier 1. The reason I like it so much is because it provides a really significant speed boost, so that's actually quite useful. But also, 24 melee attack is good, and it affects an effect range. I think it's a really decent rune. It's probably one of the better ones in here. And then down here, this is kind of what Rune of Wrath and Ruin used to be, the Rune of Slowness, which, it's okay. It's not great. Now, here's the thing about rune magic. Rune magic sucks if you've only got one rune smith. It totally sucks. The only way to make rune magic worth it is if you spam it, because their individual cooldown is not affecting other runesmiths. So by getting loads and loads of runesmiths, you can cast loads and loads of runes all the time, and you're just going through whenever you need it. And so the more you get, the more effective it is, because you're not drawing from the Winds of Magic. The more, because that's the thing. If you've got like say 10 fire wizards, all of them are using from the same ammunition. So yeah, if you've only got one runesmith, it sucks as a Law of Magic. It really sucks. And the thing is, most of the time, people are probably only going to have 1 or 2 runes in their army, runesmiths in their army. So runesmith is getting the D rank. The only way to make it a C rank is if you spam it, and even then you get so much better results out of all the other Laws of Magic. Now, Beast Magic. It's C. I'm going to put it at C. It's not the worst Law of Magic. Okay, so in terms of the worst Law of Magic in the game, I have decided that it is actually Eshin Magic. Then it is the... oh, no. It's this is the worst. Then Eshin Magic. Actually, no. I'm gonna do it around because you don't need to do this one. Whereas this is their only choice as the dwarfs. So Eshin stealth magic, then rune magic, then Nehekara at D tier. The worst laws of magic in the game. As for the best ones, where is vampire magic? Is it going to be at number 1? No. Life magic is best. Then vampire, then plague, then fire, then light. Those are my now top 5 choices. So if I was to redo my top 5 Law of Magic video, it would go life, vampire, plague, fire, light. And that is of course subject to change. Life magic I think is just absolutely amazing because the factions that can access life magic pretty much do. Whereas vampire magic, I mean, it's amazing, but only 2 races get it. And as the vampire coast, honestly, I kind of feel like Lord of the Deeps is better for the vampire coast. But for the vampire accounts, it's amazing for sure. And there we go. That's my tier list for the laws of magic. This went on way longer than I thought it would because I went into so much detail, I guess, with every single bloody spell. I didn't really cover too much on the passives because I don't think that they matter that much. I mentioned some of them where needed, but most of the passives aren't really... they're not really that noticeable. But anyway, that's the end of this one here, guys. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this tier list, whether you agree or disagree with any of these placements as to any of these laws of magic. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, because my opinions on laws of magic change constantly. Like, it's only recently that the Law of Beasts was upgraded from D to C tier. That's purely because Flock of Doom is actually pretty good. Anyway, that's the end of this one. Appreciate you guys, and I'll see you next time, fuckers. Bye.